There was a lot to be excited about during the late 19th century, with great new wealth and technology being generated by the Industrial Revolution. But alongside these benefits came alarming developments that left many Americans concerned about the future of their nation. Today, we will examine the sources of rising anxiety over big business around the turn of the 20th century, amid America's Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Let's start with the story of a man named Henry George. He was born in Philadelphia in 1839, moved to California as a young man. Despite having only a sixth grade education, George became a very successful newspaper journalist and editor. In the 1870s, a decade rocked by the Panic of 1873 and economic depression, George grew increasingly concerned over the growth of inequality in America. So, in his spare time, he wrote a best-selling book about the problems posed by big business during the period. The title of the book, Progress and Poverty, perfectly captured the dilemma. Why, amid so many signs of economic progress, did poverty actually increase? Why wasn't everyone benefiting from the Industrial Revolution? George wrote, quote, "It is as though an immense wedge were being forced not underneath society, but through society. Those who are above the point of separation are elevated, but those who are below are crushed down." Progress and Poverty warned that the very fate of the Republic was at stake. George wrote, quote, "This association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of Fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer is to be destroyed." The source of this dilemma, according to Henry George, was rising monopoly power. By monopolizing land, resources, and large sectors of the economy, the rich and the powerful were becoming richer and more powerful. As wealth concentrated, the beneficiaries became more powerful than democratically elected leaders. In effect, they became a new American aristocracy, every bit as privileged and entrenched as European nobility. As for the working and middle classes, now, for the first time in American history, they found themselves cut off from opportunity, left to lead lives of poverty and despair. Well, the popularity of George's book brought him a huge following. Most of his supporters did not endorse his radical solution, the so-called single tax on land. But George's enthusiasts did agree with his broad argument that rising levels of poverty and inequality threatened the well-being of the American Republic. Henry George was only one of many Americans who in the Gilded Age expressed concern over the rising power of big business. In particular, they were concerned about the emergence of a new force in the American economy, the corporation. Let's begin by examining the rise of the modern corporation. The U.S. corporation, like so many features of American life, had its origins in England. The British Crown created corporations to accomplish certain objectives that would benefit all of society and the nation as a whole. For example, it created corporations such as the East India Company in the year 1600 to develop trade in Asia. Most of the British colonies in North America began as corporations. Virginia, for example, was founded by the Virginia Company, a corporation created by the English Crown in 1606. The British also created corporations to dig canals, construct roads, and establish ferries. In most cases, these corporations were granted special privileges or monopolies on certain activities, and this protected them from competition and allowed them to turn a profit for their investors. The main idea here was that the government established these state-sponsored corporations to benefit society as a whole. They were very, very different from our modern notions of corporations as private enterprises. So when did that notion come about? Well, after the American Revolution, state governments initially began to grant corporate charters in a manner similar to that in Great Britain. These were mainly for projects seen as benefiting the public, construction of highways, canals, railroads. But states also began to issue corporate charters to private, for-profit enterprises. At first, the numbers were quite small. In 1800, for example, only about 100 for-profit corporations had been created in the former colonies. But as the Industrial Revolution took hold, states issued hundreds and eventually thousands of charters to private investors. By 1870, 100,000 such corporations existed, and the number was rising. There were two significant features of these new corporations. First, unlike their early American and British ancestors, these new corporations were almost entirely free of state control. And second, many of them were growing in size and power. In other words, they marked the emergence of big business. Before 1870, only a handful of factories in the United States employed 500 or more workers. By the turn of the century, 30 years later, there were 1,500 such corporations. Many of them were mind-bogglingly large. Just take one example, Cambria Steel in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. It employed 20,000 workers in 1909. So, the situation in the Gilded Age was this. More corporations had proliferated than ever before, and some of them were enormous. Let's now explore how many Americans came to view these corporations in this period. When we look back to the decades before the Civil War, we find that long before the Gilded Age, many Americans argued that corporations, especially those deemed monopolies, posed a threat to Republican values. This attitude of resistance was especially true in the age of Jackson during the 1820s and 1830s. Andrew Jackson rose to political prominence by portraying himself as a man of the people. His supporters saw him as a man dedicated to promoting the interests of average citizens while opposing those of elites and the wealthy. Jackson and the Democratic Party were especially opposed to state-chartered corporations. Well, what did they object to? Well, Jacksonians argued that such arrangements, even if supposedly done in the interests of the common good, created an unholy alliance between private interests and public officials. Such arrangements were inherently corrupt and undemocratic. According to the Jacksonians, only people with connections to state legislatures and the money to bribe them stood to win corporate charters. And even worse, Jacksonians argued, these alliances over time would lead to the evolution of an entrenched American aristocracy and the unraveling of American democracy. This explains why, in the 1830s, President Jackson expended so much political capital to eliminate the Bank of the United States, an early central bank created by the federal government. So the United States had a long history of anti-corporate and anti-monopoly sentiment. In other words, it doesn't come out of nowhere during the Gilded Age. With this background in mind, let's turn to a detailed analysis of what made Americans worried about big business during the Gilded Age. If I had to distill into one word what concerned Americans most about the rise of corporate power and the growing economic inequalities of the Gilded Age, I'd put it this way. Americans feared their nation was becoming Europeanized. Now, what do I mean by this? Clearly, Americans understood that most of them were of European ancestry. So this has nothing to do with ethnicity. No, what Americans feared was that their political culture was being transformed from a democracy based on Republican values like liberty, equality, and opportunity into a European-style monarchy. This may seem strange to 21st century Americans, but if we think about identities, individual identities, as well as those of entire societies, there's always an ego and an alter ego. On the one hand, an identity comprises a list of attributes and values that a person or a society subscribes to. On the other hand, an identity is based on the notion of what a person or society is absolutely not. Just take one example. Throughout most of the 20th century, Americans thought of themselves as freedom-loving people who believed in democracy, equality, liberty, and capitalism. They knew in their hearts what they were not also. Americans were not communist, and they saw communism as the antithesis of American democracy, equality, liberty, and capitalism. In the Gilded Age version of this identity duality, Americans also thought of themselves as freedom-loving people who believed in democracy, equality, liberty, and capitalism. The antithesis of these values was found in Europe. There, in full flower, prevailed monarchy, landed aristocracy, fixed classes, great gaps between the rich and poor, established churches, social upheaval, and incessant warfare. 19th century Americans were profoundly aware that these structures and institutions were precisely what Americans had broken away from way back in 1776 when they launched the War for Independence. So when I say Gilded Age Americans feared Europeanization, I mean they worried that the Republic was sliding towards a monarchy and an aristocracy of the elite. Keep this point in mind when you look at political cartoons of the era that criticized big business. Many of these caricatures depict industrialists as kings and tyrants who lord their power over poor Americans and who look a lot like European serfs. Now let's look at 5 key elements of this rising fear about big business. Fear number 1, declining opportunity. A hallmark of American political culture is that everyone is born with an equal opportunity to better themselves. America did not guarantee equal success. Still, opportunities abounded for those willing to work hard, sacrifice, take risks, and play by the rules. This idea lies at the heart of the ideal of the self-made man. Consider what Abraham Lincoln said in 1854. Quote, "There is no class of permanent laborers amongst us. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire others to labor for him tomorrow." But in the Gilded Age, increasing numbers of Americans came to the conclusion that opportunities for the average person were disappearing. And we can see these sentiments in the public testimony provided to a Senate committee that was traveling the country in 1883, searching for answers as to why there was so much labor unrest. One of the themes that consistently appears in this testimony is the idea of thwarted opportunity. For example, a carpenter named P.J. McGuire spoke of, quote, "the crystallization of society more and more into distinct classes, classes just as distinct as any that exist today in Europe, and a man born in one of them can never hope to reach the other," unquote. This crystallization, McGuire and other workers said, stemmed from the growing power of monopolies and corporations to crush their competitors and potential entrepreneurs. Another worker, a brass worker named John Finnerty, testified that as late as 1870, a man needed only $300 to $400 to start his own business in the brass trade, but that by the early 1880s, the emergence of large corporations had pushed the startup cost to $5,000, far beyond the means of the average man. And a teamster, a man named Thomas McGuire, cited similar statistics and recounted his own frustration in trying to compete with large corporations as an independent expressman. Now, it's important to point out that none of these men questioned the inherent virtue of the capitalist economy. Rather, they charged it had been corrupted by unscrupulous monopolists. All right, let's move on to fear number 2. Fear number 2. Gilded Age Americans were concerned about the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And we should make clear that while Americans have always valued the idea of equality, and in particular equality of opportunity, they've rejected social engineering designed to produce economic equality. Rather, the American commitment to individualism requires the acceptance of inequality in our society. That said, Americans also possess the sense that extreme inequality runs counter to their understanding of how a Republican society prospers. So inequality is okay, so long as it's not extreme. When working class and middle class Americans looked about in the 1870s and 1880s, they saw striking evidence of colossal fortunes being accumulated by a small number of individuals with names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Astor, and Gould. And they also saw grinding poverty spreading among an increasing number of their neighbors. We can observe the anxiety these extremes produced in a political cartoon that appeared in Harper's Weekly in February 1876. The cartoon, titled "The Hearthstone of the Poor," shows a wealthy family walking down the sidewalk, dressed in their finery. While they pass a cluster of poor, homeless people gathered around a steam grate for warmth on a cold winter's night, only one child among the rich notices the poor people. The rest pass by oblivious. I often show this image to my students and ask them, what book or author does this image bring to mind? And immediately people answer, Charles Dickens. Well, that is precisely what the artist wanted his audience to see. It was a shockingly un-American, dare we say, European scene of haves and have-nots. And Americans had been long conditioned to believe that their society had successfully avoided European-style extremes of wealth and poverty. Now, in the Gilded Age, it appeared that American society was trending in this direction, and many found it deeply disturbing. An editor of a Boston newspaper took up this topic in 1878 and asked the question, quote, "What is the good of having a republic unless the mass of the people are better off than in a monarchy? Does not a real republic mean that all men have an equal chance and not millions born to suffering and poverty?" And there was data to substantiate this appearance of extreme inequality. By 1890, the top 1% of the US population owned 51% of all wealth. The lowest 44% of the population owned just 1.2% of the wealth. If we look at these same numbers slightly differently, you can see that the top 12% of the US population controlled an even more massive 86% of all wealth. And just by way of comparison, in the early 21st century, amid renewed concerns about income inequality, the upper 7% of US households controlled nearly 2/3, 63% of US household wealth. And that's according to a nonpartisan study based on the Census Bureau data. Fear number 3, Gilded Age Americans were greatly troubled by abundant evidence that big business was corrupting American democracy. Some of the most infamous political corruption scandals took place in this era. For example, the Credit Mobilier scandal was exposed in 1872. It involved massively inflated contracts and shady stock deals related to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The scandal implicated 2 prominent congressmen and many officials in the Grant administration. In another outrage of the time, the Treasury Department and liquor distillers were caught colluding in the infamous whiskey ring. This was an effort to defraud the federal government of excise taxes. But many, many more corruption scandals percolated at the state level. For example, the Pennsylvania Railroad enjoyed astonishing power and influence in its home state during the 1870s and 1880s. The railroad actually had its own office in the state capitol building, and its chief lobbyist was known as the 51st Senator. And there's actually a story that on one occasion, after a day of passing several bills favorable to the Pennsylvania Railroad, a legislator rose and suggested that if Mr. Tom Scott, who was the railroad's president, had no further business for the legislature to attend to, it ought to adjourn. In New York State, Jay Gould's Erie Railroad and Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad competed for the influence of the state legislature in Albany by distributing vast sums of bribery money. The role of corporate money in politics was neatly summarized by Republican power broker Mark Hanna, who said in the 1890s, quote, "There are 2 things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is," unquote. Big business seemed to enjoy at least as much influence in the judicial system, from the local courts and judges all the way to the Supreme Court. Legal decisions bearing on business in the late 19th century overwhelmingly favored business over the public at large, including especially industrial workers and farmers. The best example was the 1886 Supreme Court decision in the case of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. The railroad had brought the suit in order to defeat regulations imposed by the state of California. But the court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, a constitutional amendment, mind you, that was passed to spell out and protect the rights of recently freed slaves, that corporations were essentially persons, and therefore they too were entitled to the same rights as people. Because the regulations in California only applied to railroads and not to individual people, said the court, they were unconstitutional. And we see that this idea generally prevails to the present day. We can see the resulting concern expressed in a political cartoon that appeared in the popular magazine Puck in 1889. It's a cartoon titled "The Bosses of the Senate." And it shows the United States Senate and the senators being lorded over and intimidated by giant industrial monopolists, who, if you look closely, are actually shaped like money bags. And their faces are angry and menacing, and each one represents a particular industrial trust, like the Steel Beam Trust, the Sugar Trust, and the Coal Trust. The bosses have entered the Senate gallery through a door labeled "Entrance for Monopolists," while in the background, the people's entrance is boarded shut. The message of this cartoon is clear. Big business has hijacked American democracy. Another cartoon from 1900 titled, "What a Funny Little Government," presents a similar message. It shows a gigantic John D. Rockefeller holding the White House in his hand while a tiny president peers up at him. In the distance, the Capitol building, which houses the U.S. Congress, has been turned into a Standard Oil refinery. And this caption, "What a funny little government," think about what that suggests. It suggests that Rockefeller has grown so powerful that government, democracy, and the laws of the land are of no concern to him. He thinks so little of the government that it's merely just a quaint curiosity. It's important to point out that Americans in the late 19th century were concerned not only that men like Rockefeller and Carnegie were very rich, their primary concern was that this wealth carried with it enormous political power, unelected and seemingly unassailable political power. A fourth and closely related development that Gilded Age Americans found disturbing was the aristocratic arrogance exhibited by some big business leaders. Almost every major industrialist had his own regrettable outburst that stuck with him for the rest of his life. William H. Vanderbilt, for example, when asked by a reporter whether he ran a particular express train to earn a profit or to benefit the public, he responded by exploding, quote, "Accommodation of the public be damned. We run them because we have to," unquote. This outburst was an absolute gift to Vanderbilt's critics, who quoted it and appended it to political cartoons for the rest of his life. Similarly, railroad and telegraph magnate Jay Gould, when asked if he was concerned about the rise of union activity among his workers, snarled, quote, "I could pay one half the working class to kill the other half," unquote. Well, many Americans were also shocked by the aristocratic pretensions of the ultra-wealthy, with their mansions, which were actually palaces to be more accurate, on Fifth Avenue and at Newport, Rhode Island, and their fondness for gaudy displays at grand balls and dinners. Fear number 5. Gilded Age Americans grew increasingly worried in the face of surging labor-capital conflict. Between 1880 and 1900, the United States experienced an astonishing 37,000 strikes. This volume of strike activity was deeply troubling just in its own right, but adding to the concern was the fact that many labor stoppages were enormous in scope. The Great Uprising Railroad Strike of 1877, just to cite one example, was the first national strike, and it involved remarkable levels of violence, death, and mass arrests. So why was this surging labor-capital conflict so disturbing? In a word, it called into question one of the cardinal principles of American political culture, one that was closely related to ideas about independence and equality of opportunity. This is the notion that America was a society without social classes, or to be more precise, without fixed social classes. This is the principal way in which Americans saw their society as so very, very different from Europe's. But the sudden explosion of strikes in the late 19th century suggested that American society was settling into class stratifications. What did it mean that laborers referred to themselves as members of a besieged working class who were oppressed by a greedy upper class? Was America devolving back into a European-style society? An aging Walt Whitman, the great poet of mid-19th century America, raised this concern in a speech he gave in 1879. Notice in this passage his fear that the U.S. is becoming more like Europe. It went like this.
If the United States, like the countries of the Old World, are also to grow vast crops of poor, desperate, dissatisfied, nomadic, miserably waged populations, then our Republican experiment, notwithstanding all its surface successes, is at heart an unhealthy failure.
What we are seeing is that the Gilded Age was marked by dualistic sentiments. On the one hand, it's an age of optimism that celebrates progress. On the other, it's an age of anxiety over the future direction of the Republic. Business leaders reacted to these concerns and criticisms in a variety of ways. Some of them, as we noted earlier, just sneered at their critics. "The public be damned," as Vanderbilt said. But others took a number of steps to assure the public that while industrial capitalism produced some troubling results, like strikes, on the whole, its impact on American society was overwhelmingly positive. So how did they try to make this point? First, they engaged in philanthropy, giving away millions of dollars to various causes. Andrew Carnegie, who once wrote, quote, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," unquote, led the way in this movement. By the time he died in 1919, he had given away nearly all of his fortune. His most famous legacy was Carnegie Hall in New York City. But his philanthropic project with the greatest impact was the building of public libraries all across America, almost 1,700 in the United States and actually over 2,500 worldwide. Carnegie and those industrialists who followed his lead believed philanthropy was the right thing to do. But they also understood that it earned them, and by extension big business, high praise from the public. A second way in which industrialists sought to fend off their critics was to build model company towns. The most famous example was the town of Pullman, just outside of Chicago. It was created by George Pullman, who presided over the Pullman Palace Car Company that manufactured luxury railroad cars. Pullman was an idealist, and he believed that workers and employers could work together in harmony for mutual benefit. So acting on this idea, he established the town of Pullman in 1880. This company town was built and owned by the Pullman Corporation for its employees, who rented homes and patronized stores owned by the company. Now, why did Pullman and other industrialists who did this sort of thing build these company towns? Well, Pullman, like Carnegie, prided himself on being a model capitalist who earned a vast fortune but still managed to provide a decent living for his workers. And so Pullman created a model community of neat houses, schools, churches, stores, and open spaces that were situated near factories that made it all possible. For a time, workers enjoyed living in Pullman, but in 1894, they would stage a famous strike over wage cuts that paralyzed the nation's railroad system. Many other industrialists, like the chocolate king Milton Hershey, also established company towns, like Pullman, and they enjoyed lots of positive press coverage that helped, for a while, to discredit critics and reformers who argued that unbridled industrial capitalism was inherently exploitive and needed government regulation. Let's now look at how Americans ultimately decided to deal with these anxieties and challenges. Essentially, what you see throughout much of the Gilded Age is wide agreement that something has gone wrong, or at least that troubling trends that have emerged in American society require solutions. But there was no agreement about precisely what to do. Ultimately, what occurs is a profound reordering and redefining of key elements of American political culture. In its simplest form, it went like this. From the founding of the Republic up to the 1870s, American political culture insisted that government remain as small as possible, exerting the least possible influence in private life and the economy. This belief had its roots in traditional Republican thinking, which argued that concentrated political power constituted a threat to individual liberty. Keep government small and liberty flourished. After 1870, a new consensus began to emerge, slowly but surely. In an age of powerful business enterprises and the men who controlled them, a concentration of power in ways inconceivable to the Founding Fathers, government came to be viewed less and less as a threat to Republican values and more as the one institution that could protect the power of the people. This notion is the core idea of what we call progressivism.